Hi, welcome to Ask the Experts, a conversation hosted by SCAD Alliance. We're excited today to have you join us. Both of our guests are longtime advisors of SCAD Alliance. I'll introduce them and then let Dr. Kim take the conversation and answer a variety of questions, but primarily focused on genetics today. Leading our conversation, as I mentioned, is Dr. Esther Kim. Dr. Kim is a cardiologist and vascular medicine specialist. She is the director of the Center for Women's Cardiovascular Health at Atrium Health, Sanger Heart and Vascular Institute in Charlotte, North Carolina, and also professor of medicine at the Wake Forest University School of Medicine. She holds the Izard Family Distinguished Chair in Cardiovascular Medicine and is the Academic Chief of Cardiology at the Sanger Heart and Vascular Institute. In her roles with SCAD Alliance, Dr. Kim leads the Scientific Advisory Committee and is a national principal investigator of the iSCAD Registry. Our special guest for this Ask the Experts conversation is Dr. Mark Lindsay. Dr. Lindsay is a cardiologist at Massachusetts General Hospital and assistant professor of medicine, Harvard Medical School. Dr. Lindsay is director of the Cardiovascular Genetics Program at the Massachusetts General Hospital and associate member of the Broad Institute of Harvard and MIT. He is principal investigator of the gVasc study, an exciting new opportunity for patients, which is supported by SCAD Alliance. I'll turn this over now to you, Dr. Kim. And again, thank you, Dr. Lindsay, for joining us.
Thank you, Catherine. I want to welcome everyone to this very special webinar. I'm thrilled to be interviewing really just an incredible voice in the field of genetics and uncommon diseases, really aortopathies, arteriopathies, including spontaneous coronary artery dissection. Dr. Lindsay, let's start with just at the basics. Why is it important to study the genetics of a disease like spontaneous coronary artery dissection?
Yeah, thank you, Esther, and thanks to SCAD Alliance for letting me be here and talk about our work. And that we're really working hard to figure this condition out. So in terms of why we study the genetics of a disease, there are different levels of reasons. One of which is that sometimes, and some of the work that's been done in SCAD so far has found that there's a limited number of patients who have gene changes that put them at risk for coronary artery dissection or dissection in other arteries. And that is helpful to patients to know that, because they can either share that susceptibility with close relatives, and we can actually test those relatives. So there's one level is taking care of the patient and being able to assess and help their immediate family who may not know they're at risk. When we talk about research studies in genetics, it's a much broader sort of discovery system. So we learn a lot about how diseases work by looking at the genetics in individuals, and not just those individuals with the rare conditions, but everybody in a study population that has the disease. We can learn about associations in their genes and in their genome with the disorder. So by doing that, we're able to understand the process by which the artery becomes susceptible. And those are not always, well, they're not at all predictable. And so it's not something that you can just look up, and understand the biology. And knowing about how a disease works through the natural experiment of genetics allows us to think about therapeutics, and allows us to think about how we could find a medicine that affects that certain process in a way that's now beneficial instead of causing susceptibility. So many cardiovascular diseases, many diseases like cancer and diabetes that are much more common, have been studied by genetics in hundreds of thousands of people. even millions of people for diseases like atherosclerosis. And we've learned lots about those processes and have been able to design new medicines by doing those genetics research studies. SCAD is just at the kind of infancy of studying the coronary dissection with the same tools that we can use for these other disorders. So instead of hundreds of thousands of patients, people have been able to study several thousand, which is great. But we want to expand on that and be able to have more power and find more associations, because that allows us a larger breadth of possibilities for therapeutics.
Yeah, I really like how you put that. So it may help the patient directly if there's a gene involved that we know about. It helps us to understand the disease overall so that we could study it better, and also, discovery of new therapeutics. So those are really good reasons to understand the genetics of SCAD. One question that I get a lot in clinic from my patients is, nothing like this runs in my family. And it is true that several studies have now shown that it's uncommon to have more than one person in a family with coronary dissection. That we know that patients often will say, oh, I have an uncle or an aunt who had a brain aneurysm or had an early stroke, or has fibromuscular dysplasia even. Could you speak to sort of who would be eligible for genetic testing or even participating in genetic research? Do you necessarily have to have a family history for participation to be meaningful, or even for diagnostic testing to be meaningful?
Sure. Yeah, let me take that those two categories separately. So in terms of genetic testing, the kind of testing that we do in clinic, where and I do this for SCAD is one of my major roles, major patient populations I see. When a person comes in for that kind of visit, we really do genetic testing for that individual person affected by the SCAD event. So, and that's, it doesn't matter if you have a family history, have a brother with it, or an uncle, because we're testing that individual patient who had the event. And so while a lot of genetic conditions are inherited from mom and dad, that's not always the case. Most genetic disorders have a rate of being new, and you're the first person in your family with that condition. And that's so we don't rely on family history. Sometimes it's informative, but we can still perform those types of evaluations in clinic, even if you don't have a family history. So in terms of a genetics study, a research study, again, it's kind of the same concept. As you mentioned, we know that most people with SCAD don't have a relative with SCAD. When we look across the studies that were done at Mayo, our studies and Dr. Saw's studies, we see that it's really like 1% or less of patients with SCAD will have a relatively close relative who also had a SCAD. So we again don't need to rely on that for the research studies. It's good to document it, and for sure there's a reason that your close relative also had the condition, but it's not necessary in order to make progress in the condition. But it can be useful, and as you mentioned, other vascular manifestations like brain aneurysm or a dissection in like a neck artery, or even an aneurysm of the aorta, those can be linked to the genetics of SCAD because some of the genes there and the processes are shared.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's we often think that all of our genetic traits must come from our parents, but there are indeed mutations that can happen just within our own bodies for one reason or another, or may just manifest differently. So thank you for clarifying that. I think, can you walk us through what a typical clinic visit looks like? So if I were to refer a patient for a genetics consultation, what are some things that patients need to prepare for? What are some of the questions that may be appropriate to ask? And how do you sort of approach who to offer testing to and what types of testing to offer?
Yeah, absolutely. So when a patient comes for a genetics evaluation, a clinical genetics evaluation for an event like a coronary artery dissection, we're going to ask a lot of questions about your family. We take a very detailed family history. That said, lots of folks don't know all their family history. Lots of families don't like, sharing their information. That's a common thing, and we can still move forward even if you don't know everything. So I don't want to make everybody think that they have to get all this information. It's good if you have it. It helps us, contextualize things, but we can move forward even if you don't have it. We sometimes see patients who are adopted, and they don't have any history, and that's okay. So what happens in a visit is basically I work, and a lot of us do, with a genetics counselor. So a genetics counselor helps take that family history and helps arrange the logistics for genetic testing, and also does the actual counseling. And that is, before you do a genetic test, there's a lot of things you need to understand about the results and how they can be used. Why we are doing genetic testing, because it's optional. It's something that the patient needs to be willing and motivated to do. And so we have to explain all the information. Why are we doing this? That's the pros, how it can help you. What are the downsides about genetic testing? We have to explain all that as well. If the patient, after hearing all that and talking to genetics counselor and I, explain that and they want to move forward, we then collect a sample. We're usually able to use spit now, saliva. Sometimes we have to get blood, but oftentimes not, for folks who are tired of needles since they've been in the hospital recently. And then we send it off. We generally, these days, people use outside companies that are genetic testing companies. And we do as well. Their sample is processed, and they look at about 20 genes that are known to be associated with arterial aneurysms and arterial dissections in people, and have a high degree of evidence that they mediate those problems. We get a result back, and then we call the patient, tell them about it. Tell them, we put it in the medical record, we inform their cardiologist, and that can be incorporated into their medical care.
I know there are lots of questions from patients about variable insurance coverage, and also sort of implications for future insurability, as well as implications for downstream testing of family members, et cetera. Could you perhaps speak to those?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that's part of the genetics counseling process. We do have to explain, as I mentioned, you explain the pros, which is, being able to tailor your medical care to a genetic diagnosis. But, what are the downsides? And there are some that can affect insurance. So what we think about is there's different classes of insurance. So medical insurance, the medical insurance you have is protected. It's a protected class of insurance. So there's two in law. There was something called the Senate Genetic Non-Discrimination Act that protects against diagnoses, and then the Affordable Care Act has protection where you can't be denied coverage because of a pre-existing condition. And obviously a genetic condition is a pre-existing condition. So medical insurance is protected by law. What's not protected is life insurance or long-term care insurance. Those types of insurances are basically a contract between an individual person and a company. And so a company can decide to sell you life insurance, or they can decide not to sell you life insurance based on your medical history. And that's not just genetics, it's any medical history. So any medical event that you have can impact your ability to purchase life insurance or long-term care insurance. And that includes a genetic diagnosis. Now, they may still sell you a policy. It's up to them. And they may, it's not like it's an automatic problem, but you are required when you buy a policy to, open up your medical records and tell them about everything that's gone on. So that's the major way that it can impact insurance. And that's really only, that's a clinical genetics visit, the one where we're doing genetic testing with a counselor and returning results to you and putting it in the medical record. That's not true of research studies. So gVasc, this research study where you send a sample in the mail and we're looking for new genetic associations, that's not going into your medical record. Okay, it's not, any results from that aren't being returned to you, and they're not in, no insurance company is going to look at it because it's not in that system. So that's will not affect, participating in a research study like this will not impact any type of insurance because it's not related to them.
That's great to know. And then what about sort of downstream testing of family members or cascade testing, as I've heard it?
Yeah, absolutely. So cascade testing is the name for if we find a positive gene test. So we find that somebody with a SCAD event, for instance, has a variant, or what people more commonly call is a mutation in a gene, and we have a high degree of evidence that that change is what made them susceptible to SCAD. If that's the case, what we do is we recommend testing of all first-degree relatives, and that is parents, siblings, and children. So it's everybody that's in your immediate vicinity, what we call first-degree relatives. Those people are typically adults, and so they get to choose whether they want to do testing. They would need to have a visit as well, and we would describe the same things. What are the implications? Why would we do this? And then we just test for that gene change that was found in the first patient.
Mhm.
And that way they can find out if they're susceptible, if their kids are susceptible. And so that's what cascade testing is about.
Let's talk about the results of testing for a second, because I know those can be a little confusing as well.
Yeah.
So I guess, I don't like to use the word positive and negative, because an abnormal test, which we in medicine say is positive, is actually not a positive finding. It can actually be a negative finding. So can you talk about sort of the abnormal results we may get? So I'm thinking of, yes, we find a gene that is abnormal that we know causes disease. The variant of unknown significance, which is also probably an abnormal finding for some. And then implications of normal testing. Does that mean that you don't have a mutation, or should people maybe consider getting tested again when we have more knowledge down the line?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we tend to think of results that we get back as you mentioned, either nothing is seen, meaning that is called negative technically in genetic testing language. But basically what it means is those 20 genes were examined, they were sequenced, and they were compared to the reference human sequences, and no changes were found. So that's what we call negative. But I think what the other end is what you described is either a result that has a high degree of confidence, or a result that's kind of in between. We call that a variant of unknown significance. So in terms of testing in SCAD, 1 to 2% of people will have a gene change that's positive, what we call positive, meaning there's a gene change, it's in that patient, and there's a high degree of confidence that it's causing the disease. And usually the reasons for that is like it's been seen in other people before with a similar disorder, or its chemical characteristics are very known. A variant of unknown significance is it's a real gene change. So there's definitely some change, but we're not confident that it's actually causing the disease. We just don't have enough information to categorize it as what we call benign or pathogenic. And it's in between. It's a gene change that we don't know whether it's benign or pathogenic. Those, if there's other affected members of the family, we can test other affected members of the family to say, with the hypothesis that, they would definitely have the same variant of uncertain significance if they had the disease. In SCAD, like we were talking about before, that's uncommon though. So a lot of times a variant of unknown significance is kind of a dead end at the time we get it. We don't do clinical decision making on them. We don't decide to treat you like you have that disease just on the basis of a variant of uncertain significance. Over time, however, they can be recategorized. If more patients are found with a disease and they have that same gene change, the companies and in our databases, it could be raised to a pathogenic. Now we know it's pathogenic because 10 other people have been seen with that gene change, or the other way around, where it can be reclassified as benign if more people are found having that and not having the disease. So if you have a variant of uncertain significance, like you mentioned, it's good to check in with your geneticist every 3 to 5 years and see if it's been reclassified. And again, if there's a good place to address your other question, which is since most of the testing we get back is negative, meaning nothing's found, do we know you don't have a gene change? And the answer is no, not 100%, but it's pretty high. It's in the 90% that we know you don't have a gene change in those genes, in the genes we tested for. But there can be new genes described. I saw a patient yesterday who had genetic testing years ago, and we found some more genes since then that have been associated with SCAD. So we decided to redo it, do a larger panel that includes those newer genes. So it doesn't change quick. You don't need to do this yearly or anything, but if 5 years go by or 10 years go by, it definitely makes sense to reassess, the older form of testing that you had.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point that genetic testing is not all the same. There are some patients who've had genetic testing, but they really only had one gene tested. And then there are those who had their whole genome sequenced. And so there's just a wide range. And then there's the commercial tests. And depending on what you order, you may get anywhere from 20 genes to 50 genes to 100 genes. And so really important. And this is why I'm so glad that I have a geneticist partner as well who can help me navigate the need for these tests. Kind of staying in the clinical realm a little bit more before we delve into the research. Are there patients who you would suggest would probably have a higher yield in seeing a geneticist and doing the testing versus patients who versus sending everybody with SCAD to see a clinical geneticist?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So yes, there are always features that are more worrisome for a genetic condition. So one of them is age. So probably one of the strongest. The younger you are, the more likely you are to have a single gene condition mediating a dissection. So meaning if you're a 25-year-old and you have SCAD versus if you're 70 years old and have SCAD, if I send genetic testing, I'm more likely to find something in the 20-year-old, just because that's just the way genetic single gene diseases work. they're more likely to affect you at younger ages and be more aggressive than the other forms. So age is one. Family history is, of course, very important. If you have a SCAD and your brother had a carotid dissection and your father died of aortic dissection in his 50s, that's really meaningful. And that family needs to have genetic testing. So age, family history. Another thing is, in SCAD, we always look at the other arteries in the body to look for other associated abnormalities. There are some of those abnormalities that would make us more concerned and more likely to find a genetic condition. The most prominent would be aortic enlargement above the heart, because that's closely associated with single gene conditions, as well as things like twistiness of the arteries, or tortuosity of the arteries in the neck, or in the heart. Those are kind of the big three. There's some other subtle ones, but those are kind of the big ones.
Yeah, I think we don't have enough geneticists in the world. I really hope that we get some more experts in the field, and those of us who have geneticist colleagues are really lucky to have that resource available to our patients. Let's segue a little bit into the kind of research that is being done in conditions like SCAD. So maybe just a couple minutes on what you see as the major findings in genetics in SCAD up to now, and then we can go from there.
Yeah. So, the studies have been going on now for, genetic studies. The first ones were really looking to see which of these single gene disorders were associated with SCAD, and the most common one is a deficiency of collagen 3, which is is a major building block of the body. And so people with collagen 3 gene changes, it's also known as vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, have a risk of SCAD, and that's the most common gene change we find. We also see other rare conditions, and that was the initial phases of genetics research. That's just kind of identifying those cases. People then started finding, building collections to try to understand better both our group, but groups across the country and the world have been collecting samples from SCAD patients. So you've probably read about or seen, findings from those types of studies, and they've broadened our understanding of what gives people susceptibility. So, for instance, our group did sequencing of about 130 patients with SCAD, and we found that not only collagen 3, but actually several other collagens, up to 10 other collagens, had gene changes that, not individually, but when we did associative statistics, that caused a susceptibility to SCAD. And so it helps reinforce our understanding that the wall of the coronary artery, the actual thing that gives it structure, the collagen structure, is weakened in people with SCAD. And conversely, there are some of those collagens that are also involved in the regular type of heart attacks, like the kind that are caused by atherosclerosis, but that risk is opposite. So there's kind of a sweet spot in some of the collagen genes where you have susceptibility to SCAD at one end and susceptibility to atherosclerosis at the other, and you want to be in the middle. So that helps our understanding. Other groups have teamed together and done what's called a meta-analysis, where you take findings from Canada and findings from the US and findings from the United Kingdom, and they put them all together to get more power. And those researchers published an important study recently to describe, a bunch more genetic associations with SCAD. And they again implicated several processes within the wall of the artery. So that was something that, while suspected, it was only one of the possibilities. So when we have a disease, we don't know for sure that the problem is local or the problem is something in the blood circulating. And those types of genetic conditions help us narrow down the focus of what's causing the condition. And I think that's where we are in kind of the beginning of genetic studies. So yeah.
Well, one, I'm just so glad that there are so many groups working on trying to figure out the genetics of SCAD, because I think most diseases have a genetic basis, at least the predisposition to those diseases. I guess what I'm hearing from you is that the genetics of SCAD is going to be complex. It's not going to be one gene like some of the other ones that we know about that potentially, now we have gene therapies for. So it sounds like SCAD is going to be kind of like atherosclerosis, where there's going to be multiple genes that express many different types of proteins that work functionally or dysfunctionally with each other to ultimately kind of all develop that predisposition to SCAD. Given the complexities and now that we're in 2025 and AI is the big thing, and we're trying to use AI to simplify our lives, but also to help us kind of organize around big databases that are billions, trillions, and even bigger. Genetics would fall into that. There's so many data points. Why are we still doing sort of brick and mortar genetic studies when we have tools like AI at our disposal?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of great things that can come out of new technologies like AI. AI is basically a connection maker. It's just a machine that can make connections, and it can sometimes make connections that people may pass by. Even people who are well educated, know a lot of stuff about a disease. It can sometimes see a connection that would otherwise be undetected. That being the case, it doesn't generate new information. So, AI takes the available information and compares it and processes available information. Sometimes it can create something new, like you use AI to write a letter to your recommendation letter or something. But that's only because the only reason it can do that is because it's read tens of thousands of recommendation letters and it can sort of link them all together and make a new one. There's no database of 100,000 SCAD patients that it can look at. So it just, the information, if it doesn't exist, it can't make connections. And then, so that, I mean, that's part of it, is that, and it can help us identify patients. It can help us identify some characteristics of patients that are in the hospital with SCAD and maybe make some medical advances. But it can't tell you what it can't tell you what new genes are involved in SCAD. So you have to do the work. You have to create that information in the first place in order for something like AI to analyze it. And so while it's promising for some types of research, for others, it's just, it has to wait. And there's no free lunch. There's no kind of easy way around gathering new information.
To that end, so that we can use technologies like AI in the future, it sounds like we need to develop a big database of samples. It's not enough to have 10 samples, 100 samples, or even maybe 1,000 samples. It sounds like you need a lot of samples to help figure this out. I think this is a good segue into the gVasc study, which SCAD Alliance is supporting. And if you could tell us a little bit more about the gVasc study and sort of what your goals are, that would be fantastic.
Yeah. So gVasc is a patient-partnered research study that is run out of the Broad Institute of Harvard and MIT in collaboration with Massachusetts General Hospital, where I am. I'm one of the principal investigators, along with Pradeep Natarajan and Nandita Scott here at MGH. And we're trying to collect more samples from individuals with SCAD to make new genetic information and learn new associations. So everybody, all humans have a little bit different genes than their parents or their brothers or their sisters, and across populations, even more diversity. And so we can use that kind of natural experiment to look for associations with a disease that are either make someone susceptible. So the kind of, if you have this gene change, you're more susceptible, but we can also find ones that if you have this gene change, you're somewhat protected.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we look through enough of the genome, and in gVasc, we're going to look at the entire genome. So both where the genes are, but the DNA in between the genes as well, to look for associations with SCAD. The way the study works is by collection of samples. That's first you have to go to the website. And the good thing is you don't have to come to Boston, or you don't have to be one of our patients. You can be Dr. Kim's patient in North Carolina. You can be a patient in Michigan. So you can be where you are, because we do it remotely. So the patient goes to the website, logs in, and you read about what it is and what we're doing and who the people are. And then if you decide to go forward, you go into what's a consent page, and you read, you need to read and understand the consent to participate in the study. If you do want to participate and you sign in, the system will ask you medical questions. Not a ton, but some basic medical questions about yourself and your SCAD event. And then also it asks you permission to link to a system called Hugo. And Hugo is actually what it allows us to do is actually link your sample to your medical records. So the ability, while you are filling out some level of information, we get a lot more depth of information if we can link it to the medical record. And Hugo can work in multiple different types of medical records, but we need the patient's consent to do that. If you do that and move forward, a kit is mailed to your home, and it's a saliva collection kit, very similar to the ones that we use in clinic for genetic collection. You just follow the directions, spit in a little tube to get the skin cell, the cheek cells, basically, that have your DNA in them into the saliva, and then send it back to us. And there's a mailer included. And that's it. And so we're collecting samples and trying to get more and more folks who've experienced a SCAD so that we can do larger scale study.
Did you have some slides that you wanted to?
Yeah, I can just go through that. I kind of described some of it, so I don't need to do it in detail, but just so folks can see what it looks like. Is that appearing?
Yep.
Okay. So this is just what the online portal looks like. So this is gVasc, and this is the entry page. In terms of how to participate is what I was just describing to you. You answer some eligibility questions that center around your SCAD event. You need to read the consent form and decide if you want to join. And then if you do, there'll be some survey questions that usually take about 30 minutes. And then at the end, provide your mailing address so that we can send a sample kit. Obviously, step one is consent, and people need to read and agree, consent. The second is what I mentioned was the linking your clinical information. This is really helpful. It gives us the much higher quality information to learn about what happened to you in terms of while you're in the hospital, what happened to, the medical studies, like the imaging studies or the medicines they gave you, things like that. The surveys are basically about your demographics, your medical history, and then some of the symptomatology that happened during your SCAD. And then the last is we'll send you a saliva kit, like I mentioned, and it comes to your home. You just do it, and then it gets mailed back to us here in Boston. And this is our team. As I mentioned, Nandita, Scott, and Pradeep are the other principal investigators. Tiffany is an excellent physician who's also our medical director. And then the team on the bottom who do just a ton of work to keep everything rolling. Whitney, who's our director, Christine Russo, who's the project manager, and Margaret, who are the main folks right now, crunching the data that we're getting in. And this is the website, and my head's probably in front of the QR code.
No, it's actually showing
not...
up really, it's fine. Yeah.
Okay. But it's really simple. It's, gVascstudy.org. And if you type that in, you'll find the web page.
This is fantastic, Mark. Thank you, and Pradeep, for putting this together. And you've been a partner with SCAD Alliance for many, many years. And so we're thrilled to see that you're taking the interests even farther. And also, Dr. Scott is part of the iSCAD steering committee. So this is a project that is very close to heart for all of us. So if you are a patient who's interested in helping us understand the genetics of SCAD, please consider joining the gVasc study, and information can also be found on the SCAD Alliance social media pages as well. I think this has been a terrific session. I always learn a lot when I speak with you, Mark. Thank you so much for clarifying the difference between sort of clinical genetic testing and the genetics research we're doing. I can't wait to see what the next 10 years brings. It seems like our learning is really kind of exponential, and who knows, maybe we'll have some therapeutic advances as a result of studies like gVasc.
That's really the reason we do it, is you're trying, it's not interest so much in the, the genetics are interesting, but what we're trying to drive towards is finding, pathways and chemical processes that can be targeted with medicines for therapy for patients with SCAD.
We're all working together to try to prevent SCAD from happening. To that end, I want to thank SCAD Alliance for all of the work that the organization has done to bring together researchers really from all over the world to collaborate together to make information available to patients and to providers as well. Thank you all so much for joining us on this webinar today with a true expert in the field, Dr. Mark Lindsay. I look forward to seeing you again in future webinars. Have a great day.